She looked me in the eyes and took their money. $2 for a pair of leather boots. That was my worth to the woman who birthed me. The courthouse steps felt cold beneath my bare feet as I watched her walk away, those boots clicking against the wooden planks. But justice has a way of finding the forgotten. When Sheriff Morrison placed that badge in my trembling hands 3 years later, her face went white as winter snow. Sometimes the sold become the sellers. Sometimes the abandoned become the law. The morning she sold me started like any other morning in our one-room shack on the edge of Tombstone. Coffee grounds floating in yesterday's water. Beans counted twice because there weren't enough for a full meal. Her hands shaking as she counted the coins in the tobacco tin for the 100th time. I was 12 years old and already knew the weight of empty pockets. Already understood that hunger makes people do terrible things. Already felt the cold creeping through the gaps in our walls, like fingers reaching for whatever warmth we had left. The desert wind howled outside our door, carrying dust and broken promises. She kept staring at those boots in Murphy's store window every time we walked past, black leather with silver buckles that caught the sunlight like tiny mirrors. Her name was Clara, though I stopped calling her mother the day she started looking at me like I was something to be traded. She had been beautiful once, before the desert sun carved lines around her eyes and the whiskey carved deeper lines around her heart. Before my father disappeared into the mountains chasing gold that never existed. Before the bills piled up like tumbleweeds against our door. Before she started meeting strange men in the saloon who whispered about opportunities and easy money. I watched her reflection in the cracked mirror above our wash basin, practicing smiles that never reached her eyes. Rehearsing words that would make selling her own blood sound reasonable. The woman in that mirror was already a stranger to me. The knock came at dawn, sharp and demanding like everything else in this godforsaken town. 3 men stood in our doorway, their shadows stretching across our floor like dark omens. The tall one wore a black coat despite the heat, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. The short one kept jingling coins in his pocket, a sound that made my stomach turn. The third one never spoke, just stared at me with eyes like a snake sizing up its prey. Clara invited them in with a voice I had never heard before, sweet and desperate and completely hollow. She offered them coffee we didn't have and chairs that barely held together. They declined everything except what they came for. The negotiation lasted exactly 7 minutes. I know because I counted every second on the broken clock that hung crooked on our wall. 7 minutes to decide the value of a human life. 7 minutes of hushed voices and meaningful glances. 7 minutes of my mother nodding at things that made my skin crawl. They spoke about me like I was livestock, discussing my health and my ability to work and whether I would cause trouble. The tall man examined my hands for calluses, my back for strength, my eyes for defiance. He found all 3 and seemed satisfied. The short man kept jingling those coins, the sound growing louder with each passing minute. Clara never once looked at me during those 7 minutes. When they finally shook hands, the sound echoed through our shack like a gunshot. The tall man reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch, heavy with silver. Clara's eyes lit up like Christmas morning as she counted the coins twice, then 3 times. 24 silver dollars. Enough for those boots and a new dress and maybe a ticket out of town. Enough to start over somewhere else without the burden of a child who reminded her of everything she had lost. The short man handed her a piece of paper with an address written in careful script. The silent one finally spoke, his voice like gravel in a dry creek bed. He told her to have me ready by sunset. As they walked away, Clara finally looked at me with something that might have been regret. But regret doesn't pay for leather boots or wash away the taste of whiskey or fill the empty spaces where love used to live. She folded that piece of paper carefully and tucked it into her dress pocket, right next to her heart. Then she walked to Murphy's store to buy those boots she'd been dreaming about. I sat on our front step and watched the sun climb higher in the sky, counting down the hours until sunset. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang, but it sounded more like a funeral dirge than a call to prayer. The hours between dawn and sunset stretched like years in my memory. Clara spent the morning in town, returning with packages wrapped in brown paper and a smile that looked painted on her face. Those boots made a different sound on our wooden floor, confident and sharp and completely foreign. She had bought a new dress too, blue cotton with tiny white flowers that made her look younger somehow, like the woman she might have been in a different life, like the mother she could have been if circumstances had been kinder. But circumstances are rarely kind in places like Tombstone, and mothers are sometimes just women who ran out of choices. She hummed while she packed my few belongings into a canvas bag, folding my extra shirt with the same care she might have used for fine china. The address on that piece of paper led to a ranch 15 miles outside of town, owned by a man named Jeremiah Colt, who collected children the way other men collected cattle. Clara had heard whispers about his operation, stories that decent people didn't repeat in polite company. Stories about children who disappeared into his ranch and emerged years later as something else entirely. Something harder and colder and completely broken. But whispers don't pay for boots, and decent people don't live in one-room shacks with empty pantries. She convinced herself that I would be better off with regular meals and a roof that didn't leak. She convinced herself that selling me was actually saving me. The human heart has an infinite capacity for self-deception when the alternative is facing the truth. Jeremiah Colt arrived at sunset in a wagon pulled by 2 black horses that looked like they had been borrowed from the devil himself. He was a large man, with hands like ham hocks and eyes that never seemed to blink. His voice carried the authority of someone who had never been told no, never been denied anything he wanted. He spoke to Clara like she was a business partner, discussing terms and conditions with the casual indifference of someone buying grain or lumber. I was to work his ranch, tend his animals, and ask no questions about the other children who lived in the bunkhouse behind his main house. In return, he would provide food and shelter and the kind of education that couldn't be found in any schoolhouse. Clara nodded at everything he said, her new boots tapping nervously against our porch. The handover happened quickly, like ripping off a bandage or pulling a tooth. Colt counted out the remaining silver dollars into Clara's palm, while I climbed into the back of his wagon. She didn't hug me goodbye or offer any words of comfort or promise to visit. She just stood there in her new dress and new boots, watching me disappear into the gathering darkness. The last thing I saw was the light from our shack window, growing smaller and smaller, until it was just another star in the desert sky. The last thing I heard was the sound of those boots walking back inside, clicking against the wooden floor like a countdown to something terrible. Colt's wagon rolled through the night toward a future I couldn't imagine and didn't want to face. The ranch appeared like a mirage in the moonlight, sprawling and dark and somehow alive with malevolent energy. The main house sat on a small hill overlooking everything else, its windows glowing yellow like the eyes of some great beast. Below it, a collection of smaller buildings huddled together like frightened animals seeking shelter. The bunkhouse where I would sleep, the barn where I would work, the smokehouse where questions went to die. Colt's operation was larger than I had imagined, more organized and more terrible. As we approached the main gate, I could see other children moving in the shadows, their faces pale and their movements careful. They had learned to be invisible, to take up as little space as possible in a world that had already forgotten they existed. Colt's rules were simple and absolute. Work from dawn to dusk without complaint. Speak only when spoken to. Never ask questions about the men who visited the ranch at night. Never wonder about the children who sometimes disappeared without explanation. Never dream about the life you had before or the life you might have after. The ranch existed in its own pocket of time and space, separate from the rest of the world and its inconvenient laws about human decency. We were ghosts haunting our own lives, invisible to everyone except the man who owned us. But ghosts have a way of remembering things, of holding on to grudges that burn longer than any fire, and sometimes, if they're patient enough and angry enough, ghosts find a way to become real again. 3 years passed, like a slow-moving nightmare, each day bleeding into the next until time lost all meaning. The ranch became my entire world, bounded by barbed wire and enforced by fear. I learned to milk cows before dawn and mend fences until my hands bled. I learned to keep my eyes down when Colt's business associates visited. Men in expensive suits who spoke in whispers about things that made my skin crawl. I learned to sleep with one eye open because the darkness held dangers that daylight couldn't chase away. Most importantly, I learned that survival sometimes requires becoming someone you don't recognize, someone harder and colder than the child you used to be. The boy who had been sold for a pair of boots was dying slowly, replaced by something that could endure anything. The other children on the ranch were like broken dolls, their spirits crushed by years of systematic cruelty. There was Sarah, barely 10 years old, who hadn't spoken a word since arriving 2 years earlier. Tommy, who flinched at every sudden movement and jumped at every unexpected sound. Maria, who sang lullabies to herself in Spanish, the only connection she had left to the family that had abandoned her. We formed our own strange family, bound together by shared trauma and the unspoken understanding that we were all we had. We protected each other in small ways, sharing extra food when someone was sick, covering for each other when someone couldn't keep up with their work. We created a pocket of humanity in a place designed to strip away everything human. Colt's business was darker than I had initially understood, involving networks of corrupt officials and wealthy men with appetites that couldn't be satisfied through legal means. The ranch served as a way station for children being moved from one place to another, a temporary stop on journeys that always ended badly. Some children stayed for months, others for years, but they all eventually disappeared into the night, loaded into wagons bound for destinations we didn't want to imagine. Colt kept detailed records of his inventory, treating us like livestock to be bought and sold and traded. He had connections throughout the territory, judges and sheriffs and politicians who looked the other way in exchange for their own dark privileges. The system was vast and well-organized and seemingly untouchable, but even the most carefully constructed systems have weaknesses, cracks that grow wider over time until the whole structure collapses. Colt's weakness was his arrogance, his absolute certainty that he was untouchable. He had grown careless over the years, confident that his network of corrupt officials would protect him from any consequences. He kept those detailed records in a safe in his office, documenting every transaction and every participant in his operation. He trusted the wrong people and underestimated the power of a single honest man in a position of authority. Most fatally, he failed to understand that some wounds never heal, that some betrayals create enemies who will wait years for their chance at revenge. Sheriff Morrison arrived at the ranch on a Tuesday morning in late spring, accompanied by federal marshals and armed with warrants that Colt's local connections couldn't make disappear. Morrison was new to the territory, a man with a reputation for honesty in a place where honesty was often fatal. He'd been investigating reports of missing children for months, following a trail of evidence that led directly to Colt's operation. The raid was swift and thorough, catching Colt and his associates completely off guard. As federal agents searched the ranch and gathered evidence, Morrison walked through the bunkhouse where we lived, his face growing darker with each child he encountered. When he reached me, something in his eyes suggested that this was more than just another case to him. The trial that followed was a sensation throughout the territory, drawing newspaper reporters and curious spectators from hundreds of miles away. Colt's network of protection crumbled as federal authorities offered immunity to anyone willing to testify against him. Judges and politicians and businessmen who had seemed untouchable suddenly found themselves facing their own legal troubles. The children from the ranch were called as witnesses, our testimony painting a picture of systematic abuse that shocked even hardened court observers. When my turn came to testify, I looked directly at Colt and spoke every word of truth I had been storing up for 3 years. The man who had owned me couldn't meet my eyes, his arrogance finally replaced by something that looked almost like fear. The courthouse in Tombstone had never seen anything like the trial of Jeremiah Colt. Every seat was filled with spectators hungry for details about the scandal that had rocked the territory. Newspaper reporters scribbled frantically as witness after witness took the stand, each testimony adding another layer to the horrific picture of Colt's operation. The federal prosecutor was a thin man named Harrison, who spoke with the quiet intensity of someone who had seen too much evil in the world. He methodically presented evidence that painted Colt not as a simple criminal, but as the center of a web of corruption that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. The defense attorney, a nervous man who clearly wished he was anywhere else, could only watch as his client's empire of cruelty collapsed around him. My testimony came on the 3rd day of the trial, and I had spent weeks preparing for this moment. Sheriff Morrison had worked with me personally, helping me organize my thoughts and find the courage to speak publicly about things that most people couldn't bear to hear. As I walked to the witness stand, I could feel the weight of every eye in the courtroom. The judge, a stern man with silver hair and kind eyes, spoke to me gently, explaining that I should tell the truth and take my time. When I looked out at the gallery, I saw faces filled with sympathy and outrage, and something that looked like hope. These people wanted justice as much as I did, and they were counting on my words to help deliver it. I spoke for nearly 2 hours, describing life on Colt's ranch in detail that made several spectators leave the courtroom in tears. I talked about the children who had disappeared in the night, the visitors who came to select their favorites, the systematic way that Colt had broken our spirits and stolen our childhoods. I described the fear that lived in our stomachs like a constant ache, the way we had learned to make ourselves invisible to survive. Most importantly, I talked about the records that Colt kept, the detailed documentation of his crimes that federal agents had seized during the raid. When the defense attorney tried to suggest that I was lying or confused, I looked him in the eye and recited specific dates and names and amounts of money that could only have come from those records. The most powerful moment of my testimony came when the prosecutor asked me to identify the person who had sold me to Colt. I had been dreading this question for weeks, knowing that it would force me to relive the most painful moment of my life. But when the moment came, I found strength I didn't know I possessed. I pointed to the gallery where Clara sat in her blue dress and leather boots, her face pale and her hands trembling. The courtroom erupted in gasps and whispers as I described how my own mother had negotiated my sale like I was a piece of livestock. Clara tried to leave, but federal marshals blocked the exits. She would face her own charges for her role in Colt's operation, though nothing could undo the damage she had already done to her own soul. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all charges. Colt was sentenced to life in prison, though many in the courtroom felt that death would have been more appropriate. His associates received sentences ranging from 10 to 20 years, their careers and reputations destroyed forever. The corrupt officials who had protected him were removed from office and faced their own trials. Clara was sentenced to 5 years in prison for child endangerment and conspiracy, though she would serve less than 3 before disappearing into obscurity. As the sentences were read, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The satisfaction of seeing justice served to those who had thought themselves above the law. But the most important moment came after the trial ended, when Sheriff Morrison approached me outside the courthouse. He had been watching me throughout the proceedings, impressed by my courage and my determination to see justice done. He told me that the territory needed more people like me, people who had seen the worst of humanity and still believed in the possibility of something better. He offered me a job as his deputy, a chance to help protect other children from the kind of fate I had endured. When he placed that badge in my hands, I felt the weight of responsibility and opportunity and redemption all at once. The boy who had been sold for a pair of boots was gone forever, replaced by a man who would spend his life making sure that such sales never happened again. The weight of the deputy's badge in my palm felt heavier than all the chains Colt had ever used to bind us. Sheriff Morrison stood beside me on the courthouse steps, his weathered face showing the kind of satisfaction that comes from seeing justice truly served. The crowd that had gathered for the trial's conclusion began to disperse, but many stopped to shake my hand or offer words of encouragement. These were people who had been horrified by the revelations of the trial, citizens who wanted to believe that their community could be better than the corruption that had nearly consumed it. In their faces, I saw the same hope that was beginning to grow in my own heart. The possibility that terrible experiences could be transformed into something meaningful and good. Clara remained in the courthouse for nearly an hour after her sentencing, sitting alone in the gallery as if she couldn't quite comprehend what had happened to her life. When she finally emerged, she walked directly toward me with the uncertain steps of someone navigating unfamiliar territory. Her leather boots, the ones she had bought with the money from selling me, looked worn and scuffed now, no longer the shiny symbols of freedom she had imagined them to be. She stopped a few feet away and opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came. What could she possibly say that would matter now? What apology could bridge the gap between the mother she should have been and the stranger who had traded her child for footwear? I looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had given me life, and then sold it away for 24 silver dollars. The anger I had carried for 3 years was still there, burning in my chest like a coal that would never quite go cold. But alongside it was something else, something that might have been pity or understanding, or simply exhaustion. She had made her choice on that terrible morning, and now she would live with the consequences for the rest of her life. The boots she had wanted so desperately would walk her to a prison cell, and the freedom she had thought she was buying had turned out to be just another kind of cage. Sometimes the worst punishment is simply having to live with what you've done. Sheriff Morrison placed his hand on my shoulder and guided me away from Clara, understanding that some conversations are better left unfinished. We walked together toward his office, where he would begin teaching me the responsibilities that came with wearing a badge. The job would not be easy, he warned me. There would be other children in danger, other predators to catch, other corrupt officials to expose. The territory was vast, and the law was often weak, but that only made our work more important. Every child we saved, every criminal we brought to justice, every corrupt official we exposed would be a small victory against the darkness that had nearly consumed me. The badge in my hand represented not just authority, but the chance to transform my own suffering into protection for others. As we reached the sheriff's office, Morrison turned to me with a serious expression. He told me that wearing a badge was more than just a job. It was a sacred trust between a lawman and the community he served. The people would look to me for protection and justice, and I would have to prove myself worthy of that trust every single day. There would be times when the law seemed inadequate, when justice felt impossible, when the weight of responsibility threatened to crush my spirit. But he had seen something in me during the trial, a strength forged in the fires of adversity, a determination that couldn't be broken by any amount of suffering. He believed I had what it took to be not just a good lawman, but a great one. The sun was setting over Tombstone as I pinned the deputy's badge to my shirt, the metal catching the last rays of light like a promise of better days to come. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the sound of children playing, their laughter carrying on the desert wind like music. These were children who would sleep safely in their beds tonight, protected by laws that men like Morrison and I would enforce. They would never know how close they had come to a different fate, how many predators lurked in the shadows waiting for their chance. But I would know, and I would remember, and I would make sure that the nightmare I had lived through would never happen to them. The boy who had been sold for a pair of boots was gone forever, but the man who wore the badge would spend his life making sure that no other child would ever be sold again.